The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are located. My name is Ramesh Sambashivan, and I am with RiskWatch International. Welcome to our debut of the RiskWatch Virtual Town Hall Meeting Series. Today, we are delighted to have as our speaker Adam Green, who is the Vice President, Labor Affairs, Corporate Responsibility and Governance with the United States Council for International Business. Before I go into an introduction of Adam, I'm going to go through a quick housekeeping slide. On your panel, you will see on the right-hand side a box that allows you to enter comments. On the bottom right, you will see chat. As and when questions come to mind, please type them in and send them to us. Our moderators are queuing up all the questions, and they will be addressed during this session. If we run out of time, we will try to gather the questions that were left unanswered and see if we can get them answered to the entire group later on. So with that, without further ado, let me go back to an introduction of our speaker, Adam Green. Adam is very actively involved in the development of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the revised OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and the ISO 26000 guidance standard on social responsibility, and he works very closely with the UN Global Compact. He is responsible for the United States Council for International Businesses policy and programs on corporate responsibility, international labor standards, and corporate governance. He has a very distinguished career, and he is also on several leadership positions and boards. Notably, Adam Green is the vice chair of the OECD Multi-Stakeholder Steering Group on Responsible Supply Chains of Minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Adam, we are really honored and delighted to have you here speak to the audience. I will hand off to you for your presentation, and then we will, once you're done, we will start taking questions from the audience.
That's great. Thank you, Ramesh, and thanks for the opportunity. I'll just wait for the slides to come up.
Yeah, give me a second here, sorry.
Well, while the slides are being loaded, what I'm going to do is just run through a series of slides initially, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions. Thanks. I'm going to give a very quick overview of the organization I work for, and then give some background to the conflict in Central Africa. Then go through very briefly a quick discussion of the U.S. dodd-frank legislation, focusing mostly on the OECD due diligence guidance, and then a final slide just with a quick overview of the discussions and consultations going on in the European Union right now on possible EU legislation. So Ramesh, if you could go to the second slide. I think you have to use the arrow in the lower left-hand corner of the slide. Oh, there you go. You got it. So in my day job, I work for the U.S. Council for International Business, which represents U.S. and other foreign-based headquartered companies with operations in the U.S. in international organizations. And we essentially do that through a global network of international business organizations. And the acronyms in that second tier from the top, the ICC is the International Chamber of Commerce, the IOE is the International Organization of Employers, and BIAC is the Business and Industry Advisory Committee to the OECD. And each of those are global networks that have particular expertise and access into international organizations. And we are the U.S. member of those, but that gives us foray into these international organizations, and we can help represent U.S. companies in those. And the key one here, obviously, is under the Business and Industry Advisory Committee to the OECD is the OECD itself, and they have they officially represent business in the OECD. And I'll get to more on that when we get to the OECD guidelines. So that's the U.S. Council for International Business. And then if you want to go to the next slide. And this is, most of the discussion on conflict minerals relates to Central Africa, and specifically to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in the Eastern Congo. The DRC is an enormous country. The capital is way over on the western side in Kinshasa, and there is a fair degree of an absence of effective governance in the eastern part of the country. And there are long-standing conflicts that has been running for many years now, with a significant loss of life. So there's a long-standing international focus on the conflict, and it's at this point most of the issues relate to Central Africa, but that's not exclusive in other parts of the world. When you talk about conflict minerals, there are conflicts in other parts of the world, but this is where the focus is right now. So if you want to go to the next slide. A key thing to factor into all of this is that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is really at the bottom of most global indices related to development and any rational nature of progress. They're at the bottom of nearly everything, and you can see them all listed there. You know, for in the failed state index, they're 176 out of 177 behind only Somalia. So they face significant challenges across the board throughout the whole country. So this is just the Congo as a whole. They're facing significant challenges, and conflict or not, the country is one of the least developed in the world. Next slide, please. So a critical question in relation to all this is the relationship between the conflict and the minerals in particular, because that's the central thesis behind a lot of these things. So the question is, are the minerals and sourcing minerals causing the conflict? And by most objective answers or measures, the answer is no. There are many, as it says, political, ethnic, tribal, and territorial disputes that are causing the conflict that have origins well outside of the minerals trade. And if you look at the genocide in Rwanda at the last decade, where there was a significant conflict, it pretty much had nothing to do with minerals and everything to do with the other issues mentioned above. Further, DRC has many conflict-rich areas that are not, many resource-rich areas that are not in conflict. And there are additionally other ways that armed groups receive money through basically illegal taxes, the timber trade, robbery, extortion, etc. And finally, there are many armed groups operating in the DRC that do not control any mines. The most significant military force, rebel force in the country is the M23 rebels. They do control some trading routes, but they are not in any mines directly, as far as at least the UN has said. So it's a very complex situation, and it is not a simple arithmetic of the conflicts are causing the minerals. Sorry, that the minerals are causing the conflict. Next slide, please. And you can flip through that. That's essentially one of the battalions of the M23 rebels on the move, and they're essentially that mobile in terms of very small fighting forces. The reason to go through that background is that the premise of the U.S. dodd-frank legislation is essentially that the minerals are causing the conflict. And it was put through domestically with no hearings, no amendments, and importantly, the DRC was not consulted. And that's where some of these assumptions were put in that really don't match the facts on the ground. The law, very simply, and many people may be familiar with it already who are on the call, has a number of very basic elements, including, do your products contain tin, tantalum, tungsten, or gold? And if they do, you're required to do a reasonable country of origin inquiry. If any of those metals originated in the DRC or an adjoining country, then you are required to conduct due diligence. And I put the OECD there because that's the OECD due diligence framework is the only one that's referenced as an internationally recognized framework. And thirdly, did sourcing of those minerals from those countries finance or benefit any armed groups? And that would lead to a conflict minerals report. The key element of the U.S. Legislation is that it is a zero defect approach, meaning any mineral source from those countries trigger the requirements. It's not risk-based, meaning, you know, if you have a risk-based system and something comes up, you can address the risk and continue going without suddenly triggering every aspect of the law or approach. In Dodd-Frank, a single grain of metal or mineral will trigger the requirements. So essentially, it imposes significant regulatory and financial burdens of any type of sourcing from the DRC, whether it's responsible sourcing or not. If you source from the Congo, you are then subject to all the reporting requirements under dodd-frank. And that's a critical issue because people are trying to, including the OECD, are trying to encourage responsible sourcing from the DRC, but dodd-frank essentially is a disincentive of any type of sourcing. So as it says on this slide, the impact has been that it has raised awareness of the conflict, but it's had significant negative unintended consequences, and the main one being that disincentive of any kind of sourcing from the Congo. Essentially, there aren't any systems in place that can ensure zero defects in the system, meaning it's highly likely that in some element there will be some hiccup in the system, and there will be some a due diligence framework would find a problem. Even if it corrected the problem, having found the problem would then trigger everything you'd have to do under the law. It's a huge cost, and it's simply much easier to source elsewhere in the world than to try to impose those costs and burdens on sourcing from the DRC. So as a result, exports from the region have really plummeted. Smuggling has surged, according to the UN group of experts. And essentially, the supply chain of minerals has been bifurcated, where exports from the region don't go to smelters that are selling into Western buyers or markets, and most of the material coming out of the DRC is going to smelters in China, Vietnam, and Indonesia, usually at a discount. So they're really getting penalized at both ends. Next slide, please. And a lot of, just as a quick word, a lot of the theory behind Dodd-Frank was that global supply chains look like the picture on the left, that they're straight line, fixed, permanent, and that essentially the person at the end of the supply chain can dictate components and actions by everybody down the chain with full transparency, while the reality obviously looks a little bit more like the picture on the right, with a very messy, self-organizing network of suppliers with significant turnover year to year, which obviously creates the complexity of trying to have full transparency up and down a supply chain back to mine of origin, which is in some cases complemented by the dodd-frank legislation. Next slide, please. When it comes up, it'll be a quick overview of the OECD itself. There we go. It's essentially, if you're not familiar with it, it's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It was the successor organization to the Marshall Plan after World War II to help revitalize the economies in Europe, and it's expanded to include most major free market democracies in the world. So its leading expertise is really in terms of good government, smart regulation, and sort of a free market-oriented approach, but with effective and sound regulation across a range of different areas. Next slide, please. The due diligence framework, the OECD due diligence framework, actually started. It grew out of a process that started a number of years ago, and the work on due diligence in the OECD started before the dodd-frank legislation, as did most of the private sector initiatives working on this issue, including the conflict-free smelter program. But unlike the U.S. law, which was unilateral government only, the OECD framework was developed through a multilateral, multi-stakeholder process that included the OECD member governments. The ICGLR stands for the International Conference of the Great Lakes Region and includes all the governments and countries in Central Africa, as well as the UN group of experts monitoring the arms embargo in the Congo. Industry from across the board, so covering all the four metals included, as well as upstream, downstream, basically from mine to end product. The main sectors that have been involved so far include electronics, automotive, aerospace, and manufacturing from downstream, but obviously mining and smelting and jewelry, particularly with gold, across the board, as well as civil society groups, both internationally and based in the region. So it's pretty much had everybody involved who has a stake in promoting responsible sourcing from the DRC. And that really is the overarching objective. It's not to get people to avoid the DRC. It's to promote responsible sourcing in the DRC to continue to enable economic growth in the region, but doing so without, while reducing the risk of contributing to the conflict. And it is obviously a risk-based system. It focuses on the actors. So if there is a violator found, that individual or that enterprise is cut out of the supply chain, as opposed to tagging the minerals themselves as, quote, conflict minerals, and then having to trace them through the supply chain, which is the approach taken in Dodd-Frank. Importantly, with the OECD due diligence guidance, it creates a single framework for everybody that is flexible enough to recognize that different companies at different points in the supply chain will take different actions. So it's a single framework for everybody from mine to end user, and it's based, if you go to the next slide, please, based on a 5-step framework of establishing strong company management systems, identifying and assessing risks in the supply chain, designing and implementing a risk mitigation strategy, conducting third-party audits, and reporting annually on due diligence in the supply chain. There's an overarching due diligence guidance that covers, it's not specific to any country or any region, it's not specific to any metal, and then there are two supplements, one on tin, tantalum, and tungsten, and a second one on gold. Right now, there are discussions ongoing related to diamonds and precious stones, but it's not clear it's not yet decided that would also lead to a supplement, but it's a possibility. But a key thing to keep in mind is that the OECD framework covers a full due diligence approach, whereas the due diligence called for in the dodd-frank legislation is only a piece of it. So they're not entirely consistent in terms of what they call for. So in our view, the OECD framework is a comprehensive risk-based due diligence approach, and what's the due diligence piece of Dodd-Frank is just one step in a different approach. So in the last slide, if you go to the last one, just to try to click through quickly, so we have time for questions. In addition to the U.S. legislation and the OECD due diligence recommendations, The European Union has initiated a consultation on potential EU regulation of conflict minerals, led by their trade division. And the 5 options that are listed there are the ones that have been proposed as alternative approaches. In our view, it's not likely that they will take no action. It's likely that there will be action of some sort. Similarly, it's not very likely that a purely voluntary approach would be adopted. The third option that's listed as essentially would require due diligence, probably based on the OECD framework for minerals or products using them entering the EU market. So that would, instead of voluntarily asking people to apply the OECD framework, it would require them to do so. The fourth option looks the most like the dodd-frank legislation as a reporting requirement. And then the fifth would probably be even more onerous and would essentially have a import ban on certain products where it says, which should be in quotes, the operator fails to provide evidence of supply chain due diligence. So that would be conducted through some kind of border measure. So it's a wide range of proposed actions from nothing to to dodd-frank and then beyond. And there are some other issues that we can get into if there are questions. That may not be specific to Central Africa or the Congo, and it may not be limited to the same metals covered under dodd-frank. Copper is one that comes up as something that is connected to conflict in other countries. So I'm happy to stop there, and hopefully we have time for questions and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adam. This is fascinating. Let me kick off with a few questions that come to mind. One is, would a privately held company that has public corporations among its customers be impacted by the new guidelines and the reporting obligations to its customer or office customer?
Yes, to the extent that most of these metals are fairly ubiquitous in many supply chains, and given the sort of interconnected supply networks that many companies have, any publicly listed company who's required to report under dodd-frank, and many are already issuing letters and questionnaires to their suppliers with flow down requests or requirements that would go to anybody further down into the supply chain. So simply not being the end of the supply chain doesn't mean that you won't suddenly start getting requests from your customers about where you're sourcing metals from. And many companies, given the near impossibility of tracing everything back to the smelter that processed the metal or the mineral, many companies are looking to rely on flow-down clauses in contracts that would ripple across many different actors, including those that are purely privately held. And one thing, I forgot to mention that there a lawsuit against the SEC rules related to Dodd-Frank. A court just ruled in favor of the SEC. So at this point, even if there is an appeal, the initial reporting requirement of May 2014 is still on track. So people will need to begin reporting next year, given current conditions.
This de minimis exception, can you please shed some light on that?
Yeah, so I'll try. This is one of the criticisms of the Securities and Exchange Commission rules implementing the Dodd-Frank legislation, is that it does not include an exception for minimal amounts of the metals in a product, including those that were left in either by accident or through a manufacturing process as a catalyst. So catalysts are there is an exception for catalysts, but if you use a catalyst, say as a tin, if there's any amount of tin left in the product after that process, it would be covered, and there's nothing to exclude that, even that sort of minute amount of metal, even if it was an accidental inclusion in the product. And so officially there is no exception for minimal accidental inclusion of metal, but during the lawsuit, the SEC said that if companies requested exemption, sort of on a case-by-case basis, that they would consider those, which was new information. They'd never said that until the lawsuit and the court hearings. So according to the SEC at this point, even though the regulations do not allow for de minimis exceptions, they would they've stated that on a case-by-case basis they would consider them. So for operators that have, tiny amounts of metals or think they have tiny amounts of metals in a product, say solder in snaps on apparel, that they could request and potentially receive an exemption.
There's somebody who's made a comment here that says correction accidental inclusion does not need to be reported because it would not be necessary for production or function of the product. And
that's correct.
One other question. I just saw a press release about regional certificates on the origin of minerals in the DRC. It's a press release from ICGLR.
Yes.
Is that something that you can touch upon?
Well, yeah. Well, there are a number of initiatives that will eventually, hopefully, become very important for what companies can rely on. The main risks, obviously, the intent of the law is to preclude armed groups operating mostly in the eastern Congo from obtaining financing by either controlling mines or trading routes. So the biggest risks and the most important risk mitigation efforts are very local, from the mine to the export point where it goes off to the smelter. Essentially, once the metals reach the smelter, there is practically zero risk that any flow of or trade of the minerals will provide financing for armed groups. So essentially, Dodd-Frank focuses on the smelter to the end user, and that's not where the risk is. The risk is from the mine to the export point to the smelter. There are not any smelters in Central Africa. They're all outside the region. So there are a number of industry programs and certification programs operating in the region, in Rwanda, in the DRC. Some cover certain, there's a program for tin. There are gold programs. So there are many industry certification programs to certify that the mineral and the metal have followed a clean mining process and supply routes, transit routes, to ensure that by the point it's being exported, it's been certified as coming out of a controlled supply chain that did not get impacted by any illegal activity or armed group activity. So those industry programs in the region will be very important for companies who are trying to comply with Dodd-Frank, because it essentially allows you to rely on those regional certification programs that would then hand off to the conflict-free smelter program as a smelter-based certification program. And then once it's coming out of the conflict-free smelter program, you would have significant assurance that it did not finance any conflict in the region or any armed groups operating in the region.
We have just a few seconds left. Can you please tell us what the U.S. Council for International Business can do for companies that are tuned in to this messaging, to the webinar?
Well, the main issue, our main role in this area has been to support and help develop the OECD due diligence guidance. And again, it was a process that began before the dodd-frank legislation was enacted, but it was to create a flexible, risk-based due diligence approach that promoted responsible sourcing in the region, as opposed to basically encouraging companies to not source anything from the Congo. So a lot of what we're doing is supporting that kind of a risk-based approach that we think follows the international guiding principles on business and human rights, and contributes to the development in the Congo and hopefully a resolution to the conflict, but in a way that still allows for beneficial economic activity in the region.
Adam, I very much appreciate your time and your expertise shared on this webinar, and we hope to have you come and talk to us again as this very important issue unfolds.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.